The mining company where I worked was falsifying environmental reports to operate in a protected area. They offered me money to stay silent, but they didn't know I had already sent the data to 3 international bodies and had scientific backing from 2 universities. There are decisions that are not made in a moment of courage. They're made in a moment of clarity. The difference matters because courage can fail, can be exhausted, can yield under sufficient pressure. Clarity cannot. Clarity is simply seeing things as they are and understanding that there is no honest way to look the other direction. I had that moment of clarity on a Monday in April, kneeling on the floor of a canyon that, according to the company's official documents, should not have been under excavation, with a rock sample in my hand that was telling me in the precise and irrefutable language of geology that everything my company had reported about that site was a lie. It was not courage that made me speak. It was that there was no other honest option. My name is Daniela. I'm 37 years old. I am a geologist specializing in environmental geology and impact assessment in fragile ecosystems. I have spent 12 years working on exploration and extraction projects in different countries. And in that time, I have developed an understanding of natural systems that goes beyond technical knowledge and becomes something closer to deep respect for processes that have been building for millions of years, and that can be destroyed in months if the right people look the other way. That respect was what prevented me from looking the other way. I worked for Vortex Minerals for 3 years. It is a mid-sized company with operations in 4 countries, with international investors and a corporate structure sophisticated enough to construct an image of environmental responsibility that in the public documents appears solid, and that on the ground, as I discovered, was a carefully maintained construction for external consumption, while the real operations followed a completely different logic. The project in question was called Operation Condor. It was an exploration and extraction concession in a mountainous region that bordered a federal environmental protection area. The boundary between the approved concession and the protected zone was defined in the concession documents with specific coordinates that I knew by memory, because it was part of my responsibilities to verify that operations stayed within the authorized limits. That was in theory my job. In practice, I discovered that my job was to document that the limits were being respected regardless of whether they were being respected or not. The first sign arrived in my 4th month on the project. I was reviewing the drilling data for a specific grid and noticed that the coordinates recorded in the internal system did not correspond exactly with the coordinates that appeared in the official reports sent to the regulatory authority. The difference was hundreds of meters in the direction of the protected zone. I mentioned the discrepancy to my direct supervisor. He told me it was a data entry error that was already being corrected. 2 weeks later, I reviewed the same data. The discrepancy was still there, and there were others. I started building the real map of the operations. It is what I do. It is what geologists know how to do. Take data from multiple sources, cross-reference them, verify them against the physical evidence of the terrain, and build an image of the subsurface and surface that is objective in a way that words cannot be. What I built over the following months was an image that differed from the official concession map in a way that could not be explained by data entry errors or measurement imprecisions. The extraction operations had penetrated inside the protected zone, not marginally, not by a few meters that could be attributed to instrument imprecision, but systematically at least 7 active extraction points that were clearly within the limits of the federal protected area, according to the official coordinates of the protection decree itself. The environmental reports the company sent to the regulatory authority described operations that stayed within the approved concession. Those reports were false, not imprecise, not approximate, false in a deliberate and systematic way. The documentation I built over 5 months was the most meticulous of my career. I took my own GPS coordinates with 3 different instruments to eliminate the margin of error of any individual piece of equipment. I took rock samples at the extraction points inside the protected zone and cataloged them with their verified locations. I photographed the excavation faces with visible geographic references. I downloaded and preserved the data from the company's internal system before it could be modified, something I was able to do because I had legitimate access to those systems as part of my responsibilities. and I cross-referenced all of that information with the official reports sent to the regulatory authority, which were public documents that anyone could consult. The difference between the real data and the official reports was systematic, consistent, and not attributable to any legitimate technical cause. It was falsification of environmental documents, a falsification that allowed the company to operate in a federal protected zone, extract natural resources from an ecosystem that the state had decided to protect, and do so under cover of official documentation that described a reality that did not exist. Before making any internal move, I sent complete copies of my documentation to 3 external recipients. First, to the Environmental Geology Department of a public university with whom I had collaborated on previous research projects, and whose director was someone whose scientific integrity I knew and trusted. Second, to an international environmental monitoring body with whom I had been in contact at a scientific conference the previous year, and that had a specific mandate to receive complaints about operations in protected zones in the region. Third, to a non-governmental organization specializing in mountain ecosystem protection with a presence in the country and proven experience in environmental litigation. To all 3, I explained what I had found. To all 3, I asked that they preserve the information. To all 3, I said that if they had not heard from me with an update within the following 2 weeks, they could assume that something had prevented me from proceeding internally and that they had my authorization to do with that information whatever they considered correct. That was on Thursday. The following Monday, I went to speak with the company's director of operations. The meeting with the director of operations lasted 40 minutes. I presented the data. I showed him the comparison between the real coordinates of the operations and the coordinates reported to the authority. I showed him the catalog samples. I showed him the photographs with verifiable geographic references. The director listened to me with the expression of someone who is processing not only what they hear, but the implications of what they hear. At the end, he told me he appreciated my professional rigor, that the company took these matters seriously, that he needed time to review the information with the legal and technical team, that in the meantime, he was asking for my discretion. Discretion. I told him I understood. 2 days later, I was summoned to a meeting with the director of operations, the company's legal director, and an external attorney who had clearly spent hours preparing what he was going to say. They offered me a confidentiality agreement with a significant financial compensation. The agreement stipulated that I acknowledged that the information I had gathered was the property of the company, that I committed to not disclosing it to any third party, and that in exchange I would receive an amount that at that time represented approximately 2 years of my salary. The external attorney explained the agreement with the fluency of someone who had explained it before. When he finished, I asked if I could take the document to review it with my own attorney. He said, of course. I took the document. I left. And that night, I sent a message to the 3 external recipients telling them they could proceed. What occurred over the following weeks was the result of 5 months of documentation and 3 days of coordination between bodies that had the mandate, resources, and willingness to act. The university published an independent technical analysis of the data I had provided, signed by 3 academics with verifiable credentials, confirming that the data showed extraction operations at coordinates corresponding to the federal protected zone. The International Environmental Monitoring Body presented a formal communication to the country's regulatory authority requesting an urgent investigation based on the documentation received. The non-governmental organization filed a legal environmental injunction that provisionally suspended Vortex Minerals operations on the project while an independent audit was conducted. And the regulatory authority, pressured simultaneously by the international body and by the legal action, initiated a field inspection that confirmed on the ground what my data had shown on the map. I never signed the confidentiality agreement. When the legal team at Vortex Minerals understood that the information was already in the hands of external bodies and that the agreement they had prepared had arrived too late, the tone of the conversation changed notably. The external attorney who had presented the agreement with such fluency called my attorney to ask whether there was room for a different conversation. My attorney told him yes, that there was always room for conversations, and that the starting point of any conversation would be the formal acknowledgement of the documented irregularities and the definition of an environmental remediation process supervised by independent bodies. The negotiations lasted 4 months. The result was an indefinite suspension of operations in the affected area, a multi-year environmental remediation commitment supervised by the university and the international body, a regulatory fine of significant magnitude calculated by the authority based on the documented period of irregular operation, and a compensation for me that was significantly larger than what the first confidentiality agreement had offered, this time without any silence clause. The affected ecosystem began a recovery process that, according to the academics monitoring, it will take decades, but that began when the excavation stopped. That, more than any other result of the process, is what I remember when I think about that decision. I lost that job. It was inevitable. I found another at an independent environmental monitoring organization that worked precisely on the type of cases I had documented at Vortex Minerals. I earn less. I travel more. The work is harder logistically and more meaningful in terms of what it represents. Some people who learned about the case tell me I was courageous. I correct them kindly. I was not courageous. I was clear. I saw what was there and understood that there was only one honest way to respond to it. I had the good fortune of having the technical tools to document it well and the right contacts to ensure the information reached those who could act on it before anyone could stop me. Courage would have been necessary if I had hesitated. I did not hesitate. That is the difference. If this story moved something inside you, comment. Would you have signed a confidentiality agreement or spoken up? Like if you believe the environment deserves real protection. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone who works in the extractive or environmental sector and needs to know there are bodies that receive this kind of report. Practical tip. If you work in any industry and discover practices that illegally damage the environment, there are international and national bodies with a mandate to receive environmental complaints. Before making any internal move, make sure the information is in safe hands outside the company. Confidentiality agreements offered after an internal complaint have legal limits. Consult an attorney before signing anything.